Sylvia Plath was sat at her typewriter in Northampton, Massachusetts, when she saw the lovely light blue shirt of the mailman and ran downstairs. It was Wednesday, the 25th of June, 1958, a starred day in Plath's journals, thanks to what arrived in the post. The letter was from Howard Moss, poetry editor for The New Yorker, who was accepting Plath's poem Mussel Hunter at Rock Harbour for publication in the magazine. At this realisation, Plath wrote in her journals, of 10 years of hopeful, wishful waits and subsequent rejections, I ran yipping upstairs to Ted and jumping about like a Mexican bean. It was only after she had calmed a little that she finished reading Moss's letter and read that he was also accepting her poem Nocturne, which he called extremely fine. For the two poems, Plath received $377, enough to cover 3 months' rent of the apartment Hughes and Plath had found in Boston's Beacon Hill. The second poem had been inspired by the landscape around another beacon 3,000 miles away. Beacon was the name of Ted Hughes's family home in Heptonstall, West Yorkshire, where Plath first visited in 1956. About 2 miles north of Heptonstall lies a wooded gorge, through which runs Hebden Beck. A 19th century cotton mill on the bank of the river is overlooked by the woods and the stony steeps of the valley known as Hardcastle Crags. Hello everybody and welcome to earreadthis, Edinburgh's most powerful book podcast. I'm Ash, your host, and today I'm talking about the poem Hardcastle Crags by Sylvia Plath. As we just heard, when the New Yorker accepted the poem in June 1958, it was under the title Nocturne. By the time it was published in the magazine in October, it was instead called Night Walk, and at some other time, Plath was calling it Walk in the Night. It was when it was collected in her 1960 book The Colossus that it was finally called Hardcastle Crags. M.L. Rosenthal and Sally Gall suggest it may be the best poem in that first collection, and for me, it's definitely in with a shout. Bluff as it's humped in different hills, this poem looks at total annihilation in the face and turns away. With languid half-rhymes and a loose metre, it strolled through an immense, formidable landscape and even detours to the dawn of time, despite its physical action being simply a woman walking along a path and then heading back. I love this poem. I love its serene dreaminess, the sway of its sentences, once again spanning stanzas, just as we saw in The Jailer and Full Fathom 5, giving it that loping, effortless sound. I also love the setting. I grew up 15 or 20 miles away from Calderdale, and the landscape of this poem is very familiar to me. As I do what I usually do on these poetry episodes and walk you through the poem line by line, I'll point out what I think is so brilliant about what Plath does musically, and offer some critical commentary of mine, as well as look at what proper critics and Plath writers have had to say about it. But I won't be on my own. To talk about Hardcastle Crags, I'm joined today by Donnie Secreast, a PhD candidate who has written about Rachel Carson as well as Sylvia Plath. I discovered Donnie by reading her brilliant essay, Stones, Turkey Necks and Gizzards, which focuses on the grotesque humour and metaphors of masculinity in Plath's novel The Bell Jar. There is a link to Donnie's article in the episode description box below. I implore you to read it if you're a fan of The Bell Jar or just Plath in general. Now, to begin our conversation, I asked Donnie why she chose to talk about Hardcastle Crags.
I chose Hardcastle Crags. So as I've told you in our conversations before, that my focus, my specialty with Plath and literature in general isn't poetry, but with my own research, I'm a PhD candidate at Texas A&M University here in the States, and I've really moved my focus into environmental concerns and environmental research, and my research interests have kind of circled around gender, ecology, and humor. And so this poem from the Colossus and other poems, this first collection, she has a lot of environmental themes coming out in these works. So I thought it ties in to my research currently, and I'm about to get started. I'm kind of in the weeds writing my dissertation right now. So I thought this was a good place to come back to. But I also chose Hardcastle Crags because I associate this poem in particular with so much of the mood and spirit that I associate with Plath's writing, which I like to think of her as this, at this point in her life, or what's coming through in this poem, as this kind of ambitious, hopeful time, and there is this quietness throughout the collection that's just stunning, and I think less talked about than the fiery boldness of the poems in Ariel. And so I love what I have a quote here, what Al Alvarez, fellow poet, he reviewed Plath's work, and of this collection, he reviewed this collection, and he said, in his review of Colossus, he wrote that their quote is this sense of threat, as though she were constantly menaced by something she could see only out of the corners of her eyes. And I think that just encapsulates the power that I get from this collection and this poem in particular.
Absolutely. It's like the whole poem is like the threat is palpable straight away, but where's it coming from?
Exactly. It's so cool. And she pays particular attention to the landscape, and in this, relatively short poem, it's 9 stanzas, each one about 5 lines, but she creates this expansiveness of the space, but not in this like cliche generalized way, but infusing it with this kind of rich history and mythologizing of the land, which is so cool.
Hardcastle Crags is a difficult poem to date precisely. Nancy D. Hargrove talks about it in her essay on Plath's poems of 1957, suggesting it was written that summer, but allowing for the possibility of it being written between May and June of the following year. In his chronology of Plath's poems, Ted Hughes dates it to 1957, but of the 21 he assigns to that year, only 5 can be confirmed as such, according to Hargrove. It was a difficult year for Plath, a half year of drudgery, as she called it, spent completing coursework and exams at Cambridge, and not writing as many poems as she would have liked. She had been married to Ted Hughes for a year, and whilst on one hand she was almost evangelical in her support for his work, she also felt overshadowed by him at times. In September of 1956, she recorded feeling sick, sterile fear in the face of his great creativeness. Interestingly, that same month she began a short story called Afternoon in Hardcastle Crags, a secret story, slight and subversive, as she put it, a story about being married to a genius. Heather Clark writes that while Sylvia frequently bragged to others about Ted's genius, here it is a source of irony. The visit to Calderdale inspired several poems, including Two Views of Withens, following a trip to the Bronte Parsonage, and Top Withens, the remote farmhouse which supposedly is the model of the Earnshaw House in Wuthering Heights. Of these West Yorkshire poems, Nancy D. Hargrove calls Hardcastle Crags the most complex, for making symbolic use of the landscape in the manner of T.S. Eliot. Plath was delighted by the incredible wild green landscape of bare hills around Heptonstall, and the Gothic desolation of the town, its graveyard, as Heather Clark notes, incidentally full of greenwoods, her grandmother's anglicised maiden name. It was also the name Plath used for her narrator in the bell jar, Esther Greenwood. Controversially, Plath herself was buried in Heptonstall, surrounded by hundreds of graves bearing the name of her most famous alter ego. Plath's mother found the town mean and ugly, despite being impressed by this wild, strange part of England. Heather Clark writes that when Aurelia visited Heptonstall in 1961, she would find that years of soot pollution had blackened the town's gritstone homes, and the sky seemed tombstone grey. Do you think it is a literal landscape, or is it a kind of a hodgepodge of here and there?
Right. Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because I do think it must be like a mixture of here and there. In 2017, I was lucky enough through my research at UNC, University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I was a Wentworth Fellow, and I got to travel up to Massachusetts and visit some of the Plath sites, and I went to each of her childhood homes, and in Jamaica Plain, the suburb of Boston, where it's like her first childhood home, I was just struck by all of the roads in this like quaint, like beautiful kind of like farmland, rural area. The roads were like just lined with these fences completely made of stone. And I just thought it was so cool, and just really, when I read this poem and she's talking about these steely streets and kind of the sounds and shaking of the tender, I can just picture her, in her patent black leather shoes, clip clopping down these streets with right with the sounds echoing off those stone walls. But of course, I know those stone walls are elsewhere in the world too. So yeah, I like to think she took inspiration from those early years in Boston as well.
You mentioned those echoes, and I wanted to ask you about the auditory qualities, especially of that opening stanza. It's so clever how she's describing flint-like feet on the steely street echoing around, and also enacting this echo with racket tacking black. It's a poem you just want to read aloud, isn't it?
Definitely, yes.
And if you would like to, please do.
Yeah. Do you want me to read the whole thing, or?
Up to you. I mean, yeah. Why not? It's only a short poem, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Okay. Hardcastle Crags. Flint-like, her feet struck such a racket of echoes from the steely street, tacking in moon-blued crooks from the black stone-built town, that she heard the quick air ignite its tender and shake, a firework of echoes from walls to wall of the dark, dwarfed cottages. But the echoes died at her back as the walls gave way to fields and the incessant seethe of grasses riding in the full of the moon, manes to the wind, tireless tide as a moon-bound sea moves on its route.
I'm going to stop it there for a moment and go through this first section of the poem. As with the Jailer in Full Fathom 5, I'm using sentences and not stanzas to divide it up, since the stanzas frequently finish halfway through a thought. For those not watching on YouTube, the section Donnie has just read is the first 2.5 stanzas. I think it's a brilliant, nonchalantly cool start to a poem. Coolness is very hard to define or defend, but for me, cool is the word. We begin with the striking of flint, and later in the poem we have the protagonist pared down to a pinch of flame. Finally, a small heat snuffed out. It's like Plath has struck a match, watched it blaze, burn down, and fizzle out for the duration of the poem. That, for me, is part of the poem's coolness. So, flint-like, her feet struck such a racket of echoes on the steely street. Let's talk about rackets of echoes. This stanza is a racket of echoes, of rhymes and half-rhymes that stack up and redouble, like a feedback loop, like echoes booming so high they dwarf their original. Flint-like, her feet struck such a racket of echoes from the steely street. So, feet, steely, street, struck such. Tacking in moon-blued crooks from the black, stone-built town. Struck such crooks, racket, tacking, black. The rhymes are so packed in, it's like hitting a ping-pong ball against very narrow walls. The ricochet is so cramped it buzzes like a hornet. And the fact that the rhymes aren't perfect, feet and steely, racket and tacking, imitates the imperfection of echoes. Echoed footsteps are immediately recognisable as footsteps, and yet they are a distortion. They don't sound the same as your actual footstep. I find it so satisfying when poetry does this. The meaning and the music, the sound and the sense are perfectly aligned, reinforcing one another. So let's look at the meaning of the words Plath chooses to rhyme. Now there's an old rule in poetry, or not rule, but idea, that rhymed words, taken out of context of the poem, should gesture towards what the poet is talking about. So, for example, in Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, he says, "But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest." Shakespeare's writing here about beauty, timelessness, the monument of his verse allowing the radiant subject of his poem to triumph over time and live on, an immortal summer's day. If we take the rhymed words from the quatrain I just read, we have fade, shade, and the awkwardly apostrophed oast and grost. We have a sense from them, a dim sense maybe, of the tone of the poem. The words have a relationship with one another beyond just rhyming. Fade and shade both refer to illumination, and what one owes often grows. We might think there of spiralling debts, but to throw some light in with the shade, we might also pick up on a sense of immeasurable devotion from the growth of an oath. To bring it back to Plath and her racket of echoes, her feet don't rhyme with any old word that happens to have an E sound in it. They rhyme with the thing they strike, the steely street, just as the racket is tacking off black stone. After she ignites the air with a firework of echoes, she leaves the town and the echoes die at her back. And again, the sound obeys the sense. The rattling echoes give way just as the walls give way to the incessant seethe of grasses. But before we leave the town, we see that the cottages are dark and dwarfed, which helps to emphasise the cacophony of echoes. It's as if she's let off a firework in a very small space. These internal rhymes are like a whiz-bang let off in a low-ceilinged study. If the curtains weren't twitching in Heptonstall that night, it's because they were blown off. But are the cottages dwarfed only by the sound? At this point in the poem, it sounds almost as if the protagonist is dwarfing them. As the creator of such tremendous noise, she seems magnified, giant-sized. But as we press on, it begins to sound more like the cottages are dwarfed by the formidable landscape that lies beyond them. Now that we've got into the second stanza, we can talk about the actual rhyme scheme of the poem. We've talked about all this internal rhyme, but what about the rhymes on the line ends? The 9 cinquains, 5-line stanzas, follow an A-B-A-B-A rhyme scheme, but the rhymes are often very faint. From the lines of the first stanza, we have struck, black, shake, and then street and ignite. The second stanza goes wall, walls, full, cottages, grasses. Now, obviously, words like cottages and grasses don't remotely rhyme, but they have a kind of likeness. Not so much rhymes as echoes. And what's interesting is, when you combine the internal rhymes with the rhymes of the line endings, you can almost plot the decay of an echo as it ricochets, bouncing off walls, and on each bounce becoming less and less like its original sound. So in line 1 and 2 we have wall to wall, identical, but then that first wall is positioned in the rhyme scheme to rhyme with walls 2 lines later. So we have wall to wall, and then wall to walls. And then as we press further, as the echoes die at her back, the rhyme scheme brings us to full. Wall to wall, wall to wall to walls, wall to wall to walls to full. Imagine shouting your name into a tunnel. The sound that bounces off the nearest surface sounds most like your own voice. But the one that's ringing off the far recesses sounds unearthly, ghostly. There's no word anymore. It's just a kind of ring, a sheen. And we have the same sort of perishing sound at work here. Wall to wall, wall to wall to walls, wall to wall to walls to full. To go back to Plath's first line, she kind of plots her rhyme scheme in miniature. Flint-like her feet struck, contains no rhyme at all, and yet it still kind of sounds symmetrical. The 2 syllables flint and feet alliterate, and like and struck have that same spiky bite from that K sound. And though as we leave the town, those echoes clear for a moment, with the freedom of those grasses riding in the full of the moon, they quickly return as we hear the paradoxical static motion of the landscape. The grasses, tireless tide as a moon-bound sea, moves on its route. The grasses like the manes of galloping horses, but horses galloping on the spot and getting nowhere, like a restless sea, tirelessly moving but never changing position. And with this new kind of crampedness come more echoes. Riding in the full of the moon, manes to the wind, tireless tide as a moon-bound sea moves on its route. Tireless tide, moon, moon, moves, route. The contradiction between freedom of movement and a sense of being leashed is nicely described by M.L. Rosenthal and Sally Gall in their appreciation of this poem, saying that it is on its way to the discovery of how to write at a pitch of pure intensity that is like being carried away, yet somehow guiding a runaway horse. The last thing I want to mention about this section is something the poem reminded me of. In and amongst all of Plath's sounds, I heard some other echoes of Dylan Thomas, specifically the opening of Under Milk Wood. It is spring. Moonless night in the small town, starless and Bible black. The cobbled streets silent in the hunched Quarters and Rabbit's Wood, limping invisible down to the slow black, crow-black fishing boat bobbing sea. Part of it seems like it's about a poet, like collecting images and then running back when they've got enough. like it's almost like a transactional thing of scoop of a head collecting those echoes, or maybe or it's a really literal telling of like clearing your head after all of those flinty. All you can hear is yourself, your own footsteps, going out, hearing nothing, kind of intimidated, and then running back. Do you think there is an upper hand there, or is it as you say, a kind of acknowledgement of respect, and then?
I think it's clear the upper hand are those environmental forces. And so definitely, and I think there's that acknowledgement there that, yeah, I can't touch this. This isn't for me. But I love the thinking about it, like you said, about this transaction. And I hadn't considered that viewpoint of this female character who's also a poet. And of course, obviously, Plath drew inspiration from her own life all over the place. But there is that transactional nature. And, she even talks about it in the 6th stanza, that all the night gave her in return for the paltry gift of her bulk, and the beat of her heart was the humped indifferent iron of its hills. And I love that, thinking about how that gift comes out in this poem.
Here is Donnie reading the next section of Hardcastle Crags, taking us from the second half of stanza 3 to the first line of stanza 5.
Though a mist wraith wound up from the fissured valley and hung shoulder high, ahead it fattened to no family featured ghost, nor did any word body with a name the blank mood she walked in. Once past the dream peopled village, her eyes entertained no dream, and the Sandman's dust lost luster under her footsoles.
So dream peopled village, also sounding rather like under Milkwood there. Nancy D. Hargrove called this section an extremely weak passage in which Plath describes the protagonist's total isolation, awkwardly alluding first to a West Yorkshire superstition and then to a popular 50s song, Mr. Sandman, Bring Me a Dream. I have to disagree with Hargrove here. I don't find anything awkward about these references, and I don't think we're jerking from Yorkshire superstition to hit American song at all, but holding one superstition up against another. First, we have the geographically and culturally appropriate reference to ghosts haunting the moorland. We are, after all, in Bronte country. And then as for the Sandman, while the song by the Chordettes might be the first thing you think of, and no doubt Plath had heard it because it came out in 1954, she was also a keen reader of Hans Christian Andersen, and her presentation of the Sandman seems to me to chime far less with the Chordettes than with Andersen's depiction. In the song, the Chordettes are imploring the Sandman to bring them a dream, to make him cute, to give him wavy hair like Liberace. It's a romantic fantasy in which they are trying to dream up an ideal lover. And the only reference to eyes in the song is the Chordettes' request that their lover's eyes have a come hither gleam. In Plath's poem, she writes, her eyes entertained no dream, and the Sandman's dust lost lustre under footsoles. The reason I bring up eyes is that with Hans Christian Andersen's Sandman in mind, the eyes are particularly relevant, as according to the story, the Sandman would sprinkle dust in children's eyes in order to make them close. Only then could he bring them a dream. There's no reference to dust either in the Chordettes song, only the magic beam of the Sandman. So I definitely don't think it's a Chordettes reference. I think both the Chordettes and Plath are using the Sandman mythos, just in very different ways. So why are we suddenly talking about northern superstitions and fairy tales? Personally, I think it's the protagonist clutching around at meaning, but finding that her fingers only close on mist and a handful of dust. Out here in the wilderness, away from the town she dwarfed with her firework of echoes, she is isolated and alone. In this utter isolation, even unsettling supernatural stories would be of some comfort, provide some token of civilization. This is a landscape that is not just unaccommodating to her, but to her species. She can find no word to body with a name the blank mood she walks in. Language, that most human invention, has failed her. It is a pitiless landscape, pitiless as the A-line rhymes of this stanza. Ghost, past, dust. Given the possible geographic proximity to Bronte country, and I found it quite funny that there is a kind of typically scary scene of out in the wilds that's hinted at but immediately denied. This, appearance of a family featured ghost. But no, that didn't happen. Is this sort of doubling down on the fact that the indifferent iron hills are sort of scary enough?
I definitely think so. I think that totally tracks, kind of with the off the cuff reading that I'm trying to do right now. That it's like that's not for me, and I can leave it alone.
Because it's almost like a family featured ghost sounds a lot more comforting than.
I know, right? Absolutely, absolutely. Rather than these seething grasses. Um, yeah, and I like this too. I like thinking of it again. Of course, there it's obvious in the with all the natural imagery she's creating, these really fresh images of nature too. But I think it does, again, the turn with that last line really classifies this as a environmentalist poem, or a poem with environmentalist concerns. And of course, I'm not the first to say that. In my article on the bell jar, I actually quote a scholar, Scott Knickerbocker has written some eco-criticism on some of her poetry, and just amazing scholar Tracy Brain, I think, in her book, has a whole chapter devoted to Plath's environmentalism here. But what I love about rereading and thinking about environmentalism, particularly in this poem, is I think she's hitting on something that's, we're coming back to in the current environmental literature, is looking at these indigenous points of view, where there's this acknowledgement of the power of nature, and there's this decentering of the human. And this poem, with the decentered narrator, the just minimal information we get about the person at the center of this poem, I think is a nice way to play around with that idea of anthropomorphizing and having a less anthropocentric viewpoint here.
So it feels like a kind of satire of a romantic poet.
Right, absolutely. Yeah,
like a Wordsworth character swaggering out and loving nature, but also conquering it. This is the opposite. All right, here's our third section, read by Donnie, filling in the rest of stanza 5 and stanza 6.
The long wind, paring her person down to a pinch of flame, blew its burdened whistle in the whirl of her ear, and like a scooped out pumpkin crown, her head cupped the babble. All the night gave her in return for the paltry gift of her bulk and the beat of her heart was the humped indifferent iron of its hills and its pastures, bordered by black stone set on black stone.
The long wind, again, very pitiless sounding. I know exactly that kind of unrelenting northern headwind that just pummels your face like Botox. It pares her person down, stripping away her humanity until it is just a pinch of flame. That flint-struck firework from the start of the poem is now just a pinch of flame. The wind blew its burdened whistle in the whirl of her ear, and like a scooped-out pumpkin crown, her head cupped the babble. This reminds me of the Colossus, where the narrator of that poem squats in the Colossus's ear, out of the wind. Here the wind blasts, burdened with noise, so much it fills her as if she was a scooped-out pumpkin. Talk about going for a walk to clear your head. Joe Gill also connects this poem to the Colossus, writing, "The resonant opening is met with a blank, mute disregard. The speaker starts off with such high hopes. Like a Colossus, she dominates the domestic environment, dwarfing the houses. Yet free of the local and familiar, she can make no sense of what she sees and hears. In stanza 5, exposed and alone, she attends to the voices within, or babble, and hears only confusion. We see her hollow head cupping the babble. She is just something noise bounces off senselessly. So we have the wind whistling through the scooped-out pumpkin crown, but as Gill suggests, we're also dealing with voices from within. I've talked on the podcast before about the particularity of Plath's voice, not her poetic voice, but her real voice. Her accent, a striking blend of American and Northern English. Certain words jump out to me in her recordings as unexpectedly Northern. Listen to Ted Hughes here reading from his poem 6 Young Men.
From where these sit, You hear the water of 7 streams fall to the roarer in the bottom, and through all the leafy valley a rumouring of air go.
And now compare it to Plath reading the third stanza of Hardcastle Crags.
Though a mist wraith wound up from the fissured valley.
Fissured valley. If you read Hughes, his voice is pretty consistent over a career much longer than Plath's. Read Hawk in the Rain, read Birthday Letters. You can hear his accent come through in both. Plath, on the other hand, sounds in some places quite like T.S. Eliot, rather proper, rather aristocratic English-sounding Bostonian, with its exhausted melancholy. The women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Elsewhere, she sounds more tousled and northern, a little like Hughes. And I've already suggested earlier in this poem, she sounds a little bit like Dylan Thomas here and there. By the time we get to the aerial poems, she has completely changed voice again. Maybe it's a little crude, but I find it very tempting to imagine this poem as a representation of being overburdened with noise, of voices, of a poet's influences perhaps, trying to shield that pinch of flame that is your own and not have it drowned out. The scooped out pumpkin head, I think, is ingenious, bottling in one image several strands of the poem's meaning, most immediately as the protagonist being a sort of receptacle for sound, but also remembering that pinch of flame and the recurring references to fire, begun by that flint-striking start. What does a scooped-out pumpkin head usually have in it? A candle. She's gone from setting off fireworks of echoes to guarding her pinch of flame against long winds. Jack-o'-lanterns take their name from the folkloric will-o'-the-wisps, lights that appear over bogs and marshes, more frequently than not to mislead travellers. But jack-o'-lanterns, unlike will-o'-the-wisps, are a particularly American tradition. So the third strand the pumpkin completes, in my opinion, is the impression of a chaos of influences. We've had European fairy tales with Hans Christian Andersen, we've had Yorkshire superstitions with the Bronte-like mist wraith, and now we have an icon of American Halloweens. So to complement or reinforce the confusion of sounds, the confusion of voices, we also have a confusion of beliefs. All the night gave her in return for the paltry gift of her bulk and the beat of her heart was the humped indifferent iron of its hills, and its pastures bordered by black stone set on black stone. In return, she says. This sounds very much then like the protagonist was expecting a transaction to get something from this walk. This is what makes it sound to me like the poet is maybe trying to clear their head, but also net themselves some imagery or pinch some sounds, make like a romantic poet and head into the hills for a helping of inspiration, only in this case to be deafened by wind and rebuffed by the uncaring landscape. We'll talk about Plath and humour later on. There's a kind of joke of this poem, which is the narrator is a blank with a scooped out head, and the poem is just a relentless stream of images, like brilliant images. It couldn't be less of an empty blank of a poem.
Exactly. Right. Totally. And I loved how you brought this up, that we don't know much about the subject of the poem, right? So we have the narrator who is kind of this third person, omniscient thing, this entity narrating, who kind of has this long view of history, but also this ability to foresee if this, subject, gendered female, were to go along this path, she'd be, crushed to mere quartz grit, as Plath writes. So a lot of interesting factors going into this one.
And here's Donnie reading our final section of Hardcastle Crags, from the last word of stanza 6 to the last word of stanza 9.
Barns, guarded broods, and litters behind shut doors. The dairy herds knelt in the meadow, mute as boulders. Sheep drowsed stoneward in their tussocks of wool, and birds, twig sleeping, wore granite ruffs, their shadows, the guise of leaves. The whole landscape loomed absolute, as the antique world was once in its earliest sway of lymph and sap, unaltered by eyes, enough to snuff the quick of her small heat out. But before the weight of stones and hills of stones could break her down to mere quartz grit in that stony light, she turned back.
So we start off with the image of life being turned to stone. The dairy herds are mute as boulders, the sheep drowse stoneward, and the birds wear granite ruffs. It's repetitive, it's uncompromisingly frank, stone on stone on stone, appropriate for a poem with a title as stony as Hardcastle Crags. Nancy Hargrove writes that she sees the animals as taking part in this silent but devastating conspiracy against humanity. They are shut up in barns, in effect shutting her, the protagonist, out. We have a chill of prehistoric indifference as Plath compares the whole landscape to the antique world, in its earliest sway of lymph and sap, unaltered by eyes. It is futile to imagine one having any dominion over such a landscape, laughable even to imagine that you can understand something as inconceivably old. Plath is so good at making you shiver at your own puny wingbeat of a lifespan in comparison to the ancient world. I think of the sea in Full Fathom 5 on which the ages beat like rains, and similarly to imagine the world in its earliest sway of lymph and sap can be doubly unsettling, making us think of our own feeble softness. We're just squelching bags of lymph and sap in a hard world of indifferent iron, after all. But reading it, you also feel paradoxically and powerlessly protective of the world, thinking of it in its earliest sway, cast alone in a hard universe, the unlikeliness of it. For me, it makes me cringe the way a fontanelle makes me cringe. That is much too soft for a world full of corners. Enough to snuff the quick of her small heat out, but before the weight of stones and hills of stones could break her down to mere quartz grit in that stony light, she turned back. What do you notice first from that? We've got the final spin on the flame imagery, but what sticks out for me is again the repetitive stoniness. Stones and hills of stones could break her down to mere quartz grit in that stony light. You can hear on the recording of Plath how deliberately she drones those stones.
But before the weight of stones and hills of stones could break her down to mere quartz grit in that stony light.
Like wall to wall to walls, like black stone on black stone, Plath is relentlessly stony. The reason I think she rhymes words with themselves here is to emphasise the howling meaninglessness the protagonist is presented with. I talked earlier about meaningful rhyme words in poems, words that have a relationship beyond just sounding the same. Shade and fade from that Shakespeare example. And I think part of the reason why poets do this is a kind of wish fulfillment. We instinctively want there to be meaning in rhyme, which is why you find rhyme so frequently in advertising. Don't just book it, Thomas Cook it. A travel agency is here trying to give you the impression that they are obscurely qualified in booking you a holiday because their name has an uk sound like the word book. We know it's nonsense, but we can't help liking or at least noticing rhyme, and so our ears might be a little bit conned even if our brains aren't. By contrast, rhyme words with themselves sounds hollow. There's no transformation, there's no echo anymore, it's just a blunt repetition. There's nothing flint-like. Nothing sparks when you hold one word up against itself. Our protagonist left the town in search of meaning, something in return, but all she got was deafened with howls and given the cold shoulder by that uppity hill. She turns back because despite whatever reason she left the town, meaning and transformation were available to her there. She wielded echoes like fireworks. She dwarfed the town. The protagonist was not ready for the full strength of that landscape. It would have broken her down to mere quartz grit. She wouldn't have got the pearl that Plath quite often writes about in regard to hard-won rewards. She sensed all she would get in return was mere grit, and so she turned back. I don't see this as a defeat so much as an acknowledgement of limitations. She walked as far as she could go. Unlike the tireless tide grasses galloping on the spot in the full of the moon, our protagonist still has agency enough to turn back, to leave, and to trade the full of the moon for the moon-blued crux of the town. With the narrator being a blank, the landscape gains more power and more personality than the human. I mean, the inert, non-sentient aspects of the landscape, even if they're indifferent, they at least have an edge. Whereas she, if we are to call her she, is a blank. And I wondered why this is, whether it was a submission to nature or. Right. With that scooped out head, it almost feels like she's doing it on purpose, like casting her head, trying to fill herself or something. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I love this, thinking about nature having the edge. I love that you use that word. And I think that also ties back to what we were talking about of how Plath brings about that effect. And she's using that incessant seething of the grass to do it, and these other moments of characterizing the landscape in this not necessarily a friendly way, but really a more unsettling way. And so I love this, thinking about it as does nature have the upper hand? And I love what's so interesting about this is, yes, it could be this poem of this epic of this small kind of nameless subject, female subject, woman character facing nature. But what I love about it is that it doesn't end in this conquering or necessarily a submission. I think that this character, the subject of the poem, I think she sees the immense power of these natural forces that she's encountering, and she chooses to turn back. And I think that is a power in her own right. And I mean, I think there are all sorts of great allegories and so much symbolism in here to where we could tie this to, okay, what is Plath doing? Is this, immense nature, this overwhelming, not quite welcoming nature? Is this supposed to symbolize perhaps, the mood of the era of the 1950s and 60s, really, pronounced oppression of women. And I think it's almost more interesting in that, to think of it as less broad and less generalized, and just thinking of this woman and this distinctly feminine experience of, coming into contact with these forces greater than oneself, and that the feminine reaction in this battle between a small person against large nature, that instead of submitting or trying to conquer, which could be like a really colonialist reading, this female character turns back and kind of stays in her own lane and is smart enough to recognize what's not hers, I think, is one reading of this.
Because it all literally turns on that last. I mean, it could end at crushed to quartz grit, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I'm
afraid that's all we have time for today on Hardcastle Crags. Huge thank you to my guest, Donnie Secreast. Make sure that you check out her article, linked in the episode description box below. And tune in again tomorrow for an extended conversation with Donnie, where we talk more about Plath, Donnie's work, and squishiness and hardness in the work of Plath. We talk about the bell jar, and we talk a bit more about Hardcastle Crags and some other poems as well. Really hope you enjoyed this video. If it's the first one you've seen, I've done a few more like this on Plath poems. There will be links below as well, and there's plenty more on the way. Until then, happy reading.
Once past the dream-peopled village, her eyes entertained no dream, and the sandman's dust lost lustre under her foot soles.